Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review two horror movies. At the end of the day, we are reviewing the 2019 variation of Pet Sematary, and then we are going to be reviewing The Prodigy. Both of these movies I went out of my way to say that I had saw on Hulu, so ultimately you can go through and watch either one of these movies on there. So dare say, yeah, you can both watch these movies on Hulu. At the end of the day, I watched them just because they kind of looked quasi in the horror realm of things. If anything, when going through this review, I'm going to try as much as humanly possible to try to remember character names in this movie, in both these movies, because I simultaneously review them while also reviewing the Wesley Snipes Blade movie and a lot of other things, trying to get a bunch of crap all done today. So if anything, if there's any characters that I probably missed or mix up or anything like that, I do apologize. But I'm going to try as much as possible to narrow down for a lot of people any character names or stuff like that, because more than likely there's a lot of stuff going on in this brain. So in that same vein, I do apologize for any mix-ups or anything like that. So yeah, trying to review as much as possible, and eventually my brain at some point is going to turn into a blender at some point. So first, let's ultimately let you know I'm going to go through both these movies, and at first, very much do this in a very cryptic like sense, talk about these movies, go into double five time territory, and then ultimately spoil both these movies. So, if ultimately you want to completely be avoided of any number of these spoilers, ultimately I'm going to be talking about the Pet Cemetery first. If ultimately you want to be just hearing the cryptic sense about this movie, ultimately, once I get into the double five time territory, you can fast forward through the video and ultimately wait till I change screen. And then once I do, you can stop right there and hear what I have to say about The Prodigy if you want to just hear that movie instead of the Pet Cemetery. However you want to do this, by all means, let's get into these movies. So, Pet Cemetery, because I ultimately want to try to bash these out as quickly as possible because I know how long this is probably going to take. So, anyways, Pet Cemetery. This movie actually, I think, got a ton of flack. Like, I think a lot of people were talking about how stupid it was, or how just, uh, how, like, dumb it was, or just nobody, I think, liked it. Like, I honestly, when watching this movie, did not think that this movie was honestly that bad. Like, I thought that it was kind of a very interesting approach. I kind of liked how they tried to, at some points, try to do some different things to make it to where it's not just like once these people are living in this area, it's much more so the fear of things being brought back from once they came. It's much more an always unsettling feeling with them just being in the environment that they're in, which I kind of thought was actually intriguing. We get a because I'm trying to remember the very original Pet Cemetery movie with the guy who was Eddie Munster was in that variation, and trying to remember that, but it's been so long since I saw that movie. So I'm assuming maybe the character who ultimately I believe plays Lewis, who's the dad. I think the maybe the background of the character is probably similar. I don't know, but I really thought it was kind of intriguing to have a doctor that usually would do like the graveyard shift and would have his wife left at home to just kind of take care of the kids. But eventually, while she's taking care of the kids, she is having some um, like issues at home and stuff like that, as well as some of the kids are starting to have issues at home, and to where eventually when uh, Lewis is thrusted into being at home for this and that or whatever, eventually he is starting to slowly but surely, as well as seemingly everybody else, lose their effing mind. We have John Lithgow in this movie. Ultimately, I love John Lithgow and pretty much anything. So easily having a movie with John Lithgow in it easily wins me over, because ultimately I just really enjoy John Lithgow, but as I've said his name plenty of times right now. So John Lithgow in this movie ultimately goes to being the nice and kind, concerned neighbor that is eventually going to walk Lewis's character through the whole process of of the pet cemetery, let's just say. And ultimately we find out this character is John Lithgow's character, I believe his name is Judd, that is really to struggling through the processes that that Lewis is going to, because it's oh so easy to please a friend, please a neighbor, or to ultimately think at the end of all things are going to end up differently for a new person in town. So ultimately, I remember full well that I think there was in the original movie a very much issue with the younger son, I think, in this family. And so we're gonna see via the spoiler version if this movie goes the exact same way. Uh, yeah, I thought that there were some interesting ways in which this story tends to go to. There was a lot of times where there was like for me, I think I just enjoy this movie just because I went into it thinking that this was going to be an awful movie, and I think I just ended up enjoying it because like I took every single ambitions out, and I thought that this was going to be a dreadful movie that I ultimately was not going to like. And after watching it, I was like, you know what, this wasn't a bad film. Like I didn't understand where everyone was coming from with this movie and attacking it and whatever. Like ultimately to me it's just like, man, it's not a bad film. It's not really a bad film to me, I thought. But anyways, uh, people ultimately have their perceptions about uh, the the very first one of these movies or anything that followed after that. So yeah, let's get into the spoilers about this movie. So let's go out of our way to do the double five time count. Ultimately, again, if you want to hear no spoilers about this movie, go into Hulu, watch it, and come back here and then hear all the spoilers that I have to say. And at the end of the day, you can skip these whole spoilers by the changing of the screen. Ultimately, I can go right into the Prodigy for you. So, let's go into spoilers about this movie. So, spoiler time at the end of the day. This is not a bad movie. So delayed shot fired. But yeah, so we ultimately have Lewis and family. I think the wife's name was Rachel. I'm trying to think what the daughter's name is. It'll probably come to me maybe somewhere in the review. Maybe. So we have Lewis, who's ultimately driving his family on a road trip to a new home, and basically making a joke that it's going to take him another 8 hours to get there. And ultimately Lewis is asking his daughter like if she's excited about 8 more hours on the road, and she's like, oh no 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 no. And like bejokingly telling her that there's 8 more hours of this road trip, to ultimately just tell her no, the house is right around the corner. And so they they immediately go into the house, and they're trying to like look to see like, okay, who's gonna get what room and everything like that. So reasonably, they're just kind of going about their days, and eventually it seems like they're a very happy-go-lucky couple at first. It seems that they're kind of reflecting on what kind of got them there, realizing that Lewis is a graveyard shift doctor, and eventually once he goes into some of his patients in the hospital, it seems like he is fighting a lot of no-win scenarios, where once he gets certain patients, they're basically right on the edge of death or just on their way there. So we ultimately have it to where, going on into this movie, eventually the mother and the two kids are just kind of like out and about, just kind of checking out things, and then eventually they're starting to notice a group of people all wearing bizarrish like pet masks, all making their way down to somewhere into part of their land. And ultimately the kids are trying to understand what is going on, and the mother is just like, well, hey, like, they're trying to perform some service. They're trying to do some funeral esh like thing. We'll just go and let them do it. So eventually, shortly thereafter that, we have this character named John Lithgow appears to meet the daughter. I believe her name is, it's like L. It's L or L. It has L in it. Maybe it's Ellie. I'm probably just gonna call her uh L. God, I think it's Ellie. So I'll just call her that, I guess. So we have to where Judd is meeting the daughter, and like this daughter is very welcoming to seemingly this stranger, and so eventually Judd is there to talk to these neighbors and kind of tell them what is going on, that ultimately there's a pet cemetery somewhere in the parts of their land, because eventually they ask, it's like, well, hey, if we own 54 acres of land, isn't that right on the pet cemetery? And John Lithgow immediately is just like, well, yes. But, like, if anything, like, you can kind of do whatever you want with that land, but a lot of people just know that as the pet cemetery. So, eventually, it ends up, Lewis ends up coming home to eventually be told that Jet had come by, one of her neighbors, and so eventually Lewis comes over, uh, has a couple beers to meet Judd and kind of like talk it out and this and that, and kind of like be a nice neighbor and this and that. So eventually, Ellie is having a or no, wait. Eventually they're having like a I think it's either somebody's birthday, or they're trying to have like a party of some kind, because Rachel, the mother, is starting to feel very uneasy about this house. She is starting to brew up uh some haunting like things of remembering her ill sister that she had to try to take care of, and by sending up meals through this little conveyor belt like small elevator to send her up meals, because this sister of hers was very uh, had very poor bone structure, and was just really very much to where her sister had to consistently take care of her. But at some point, the little small elevator thing stopped working at one point, to where the girl had stopped getting meals, to the point to where eventually she, I guess, shimmied herself down this small elevator shaft like thing to I guess be said that she had died trying to shimmy down this small elevator shaft. So eventually, at a lot of points, like the mother is opening up these small little um like she's opening up the medicine cabinet, and plop here's this meal, and then plop here's her sister to scare the crap out of her. And ultimately uh we have Lewis that is also like seemingly either like it seems like he's sleepwalking or something like that. He's starting to see things like just as well he's walking through the house. All of a sudden he's in the woods somewhere where there are people going to this pet funeral, still wearing the pet masks and stuff like that. And eventually Lewis is reminded by certain patients that he had lost, and he's getting scared by them. So eventually, like a lot of the family is starting to feel quasi uneasy, and so Rachel is already thinking about, hey, how about we get out of this house and kind of go to a family member out of town? And Lewis is just like, dude, we just got here. Like, how about we just have like a housewarming party? Because ultimately, someone's, I think it's someone's birthday in the house coming up soon, or like something is coming up soon, and so relatively they're just like, hey, how about we just have a party and just kind of like maybe that like us getting to know the neighborhood and everything like that will just like change everything. So they go and they have this party. Judd comes along, and Lewis is starting to look for the cat. It seems like this cat is like an outdoors cat, and so eventually they figure that he'll just come on along home. So eventually, Lewis is looking for the cat. He's looking everywhere for it, and eventually, while this party's going along, Judd and Lewis end up finding this cat, and the cat looks quasi like roadkill. And so Ellie eventually is coming and eventually finding her father, and Lewis tells Judd that it's like, hey, we can't let her see this. So eventually, Ellie is trying to get her. Lewis is trying to get Ellie away from seeing her cat and getting her back to this party. So eventually, before all this, we have it to where the mother is going to tell her daughter before all of this that about life and death, that if you die at some point, you'll probably go to heaven. That's where, if anything, like her, that's where her mother is telling her that it's like ultimately, well, hey, you know, some of the pets that we ultimately had said that had gone to a farm, or ultimately like some of the relatives or something that we had said gone away, we ultimately would tell you that they would go to heaven. And it seems like Lewis's character is kind of very much, he doesn't believe in heaven, and he's ultimately telling his wife afterwards, like, no, we probably shouldn't actually tell her that people go to heaven, because he, I guess, is an atheist and he doesn't believe in heaven and all that. So it's like, how about we actually tell her the truth? And her wife is just like, well, like, what do you think that we should really tell her? Like, it's like, come on, like, have her like kind of give her this like still fairy tale like ish like story that everything has a happy ending. And like, what are you going to tell her if you're going to tell her like what you think? And so eventually, yeah, so pushes us now to have it to where Lewis is telling his wife that, okay, yeah, our cat is now dead. What am I going to tell Ellie? And ultimately, Rachel tells Lewis to tell his daughter that the cat ran away. And so, reasonably, that is the line uh, that Lewis is going to feed to his daughter. But um, but when Judd ultimately sees Lewis seeing this cat, immediately Judd asks him, like, "Hey, does your daughter love this cat? Do you love this cat? Like, do you think that like you really want this cat to still be alive and this and that?" And so Lewis is saying, "Yes, of course." So Judd is taking Lewis and ultimately telling him, "Hey, like, uh, we're gonna go and bury this cat." And so they go to the pet cemetery, but Judd takes him a little bit further. He's like, "No, we're gonna take this cat here." So Lewis is just kind of like, "Okay, this is a little weird. Like, what's going on? If anything, you're taking me further than where I thought that we'd have to just bury this cat. It's like, what's going on?" And so John tells him what to do, and then he basically tells him, he's like, "Okay, uh, if like he basically tells him that at some point Judd had a dog, and ultimately that dog had a real mean streak, but that dog had some point died, and so Judd had uh, buried him into this cemetery, and the very next day the dog had come back. And so at first Judd was all happy that this dog had come back, but then eventually this dog had come back and had started to hurt the ones that he loved. So immediately he had to put it back down. But immediately what Judd uh, tells Lewis is like, well, um, if anything, this pet cemetery really plays on your grief. And so reasonably immediately seeing you react to this cat being killed and thinking about your girl that I just met, like, I just felt so like overwhelmed with needing to help you out. Um, And so immediately, like I told you about this pet cemetery, and to hope that this cat will be different, and to where when this cat comes back the very next day, that ultimately this cat will be brought back to you and be fine. But sometimes when these things are brought back, they are different. So immediately the cat or Lewis is ultimately going to have to confirm to to his daughter, you know what? Poopsie ran away, or whatever the cat name was. So he goes to her and he's like, Ellie, you know what? The cat had run away. It's too bad. And Ellie's like, what are you talking about? It's like the cat is right there. And immediately the cat is there, but the cat looks a little like frazzled. And so immediately at some point, like the girl is like kind of running a comb through the cat, trying to get some schmutz or something from the cat, and eventually the cat like severely claws the girl to where ultimately the girl screams and cries to where ultimately the father ends up like putting a band-aid on her, and he's like, man, this cat, like there's something up with this cat. And so it gets to the point to where like to where more and more this cat starts like like quasi like grabbing on to the family and clawing, and to the point to where they're almost like afraid if this cat is going to almost like suffocate and or kill some part of the family, especially like when the cat is nearby the smaller son, which Cage baby Cage Cage it's somewhere in there. I'm just gonna say the boy. I'm gonna say the little boy. That's what his name is gonna be for the rest of this. Yeah. So we have we have little boy that is by the cat, and so it gets to the point to where ultimately Lewis is just like, I can't trust this cat around my family. It seems like at any point in time when Lewis is gonna like try to pet the cat or whatever, the cat is going to attack him. So he's like, you know what, I'm done with this cat. So Lewis drives all the way in the middle of nowhere into some forest part and park or whatever, and lets the cat go and says, "Be free," because ultimately he was going to put some needle to put it to sleep, but instead he's like, "I can't do that." So ultimately he decides to just let the cat go off. Eventually, when doing that, eventually the very next day, the cat finds its way back to the home. I'm like, oh my god, like this very interesting Ash like thing going on here. So, anyways, so we eventually have it being Ellie's birthday. Here's where we go. I'm like, there was some party before. Now it's to Ellie's birthday party. So we we get it to where there's this birthday party going on. It seems like people are at great spirits, this and that. And so Ellie eventually is out in the road to see her cat and say, "Oh hey, hey cat, how's it going?" Because ultimately she at some point didn't want her cat to come into her room. She had told her dad, "Hey, like close my door so the cat doesn't get in here because this cat is just different." So it gets to the point to where the cat, or to where the girl is looking at the cat and like is in the middle of the road, to where eventually we have this giant semi barreling his way down this road. And then we also have Gage, the little boy. I think that's his name. I don't know. The little boy going and walking to the point of walking out to the street. And we have Lewis, who is like going, "Oh my god, my son is making it out to the street. I need to intercept this." Not even knowing that his daughter is out in the street as well. What great parenting we have here, I guess, in this movie, but it is what it is. So Lewis is running full speed to get to Gage, and all of a sudden there is this giant semi that is really quickly pumping on the brakes as quickly as possible, because this guy was like fumbling around with his cell phone and had all of a sudden realized that he has to brake really quickly. So the truck ends up coming undone. This second half of the truck ends up going barreling through the road, and we have Lewis with the younger boy, but Rachel starts running after, or running onto the road as well, and she realizes that her daughter was taken down by this semi, and she is just lost it. And so she takes her and her boy, and just after that just leaves. Like, she is done with this place. It keeps reminding her of her lost sister, and she can't deal with it. Uh on top of losing her daughter, she is just gonzo. And so, because they had a funeral for their daughter, and again, wife is just gone. So the father is kind of talking to Judd, and Judd keeps bringing up, it's like, I know what you're thinking. Like, I know like, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, I get it. I know that this is probably going to drive you to uh to do what I think you're going to do, but don't do it. Like, if anything, she'll probably come back different. Like, don't do it. But the grief will get to you, but don't do it. And so we have it to where Lewis goes to the graveyard, digs his own daughter up, and buries her in the pet cemetery. And of course, she comes back, and ultimately, Lewis is so happy that she's back that he completely neglects that she's probably going to come back different. So basically, he is having her uh, having her go into a bath, and he is combing her hair, and all of a sudden, like, realizing there's some rough things going on with her hair. He's trying to get some like split ends or whatever out of her hair, but then realizes that there's a whole like thing that they uh had to like staple together on the back of her head. And he notices this, and he's like, "Oh my god." And then she's like, "What, daddy?" And he's like, "Oh no, I was just trying to just comb your hair." So Lewis is completely like trying to neglect everything, and his big thing once Rachel comes back home is that he needed more time. He needed more time with his daughter. And so when Rachel and Gage are back home from after leaving, they aren't willing to accept this. And immediately Rachel is just like, this is not my daughter. And so we get into the aspect where eventually, again, Rachel, the mom, is still being haunted by her sister, even to the point to where she is seeing a whole like drudged up thing where the mother is playing the the role of her own sister to replay the struggles of her trying to get dinner with her like very much difficult body to try to make it to this elevator to get to this meal and this and that. So it gets to the point to where uh, to where we have it to where the daughter is eventually like realizing that she knows every single point of grief of all of these family members, and so she is digging in and kind of mentioning all of them to the point where eventually she goes and just starts with a kitchen knife just stabbing away at her mother to eventually just drag her into this cemetery as well to be changed. And so leading to where the father is running to get put Gage into the car and ultimately telling Gage, don't open the door for anybody. Uh, don't open the door for anyone. So he closes the door, leaving this kid in this car. And so Lewis goes and runs out to the cemetery to confront his daughter, to where eventually he tries to like stop his daughter from doing all of this. But it gets just to the point where eventually that he ends up also getting stabbed, also getting killed. And then eventually they all go into the pet cemetery to be brought back, and then to eventually um, be at the car with the kid, and the father is just kind of paddling at the door to get the kid to open the door. So the entire family is turning into these crazy uh, zombie killer esh like people because they all turned, and so now all that's left is the kid. So yeah, very interesting like approach. Ultimately, the kid. Let's revert back a little bit. So what happens to John Lithgow? So it gets to the point where John Lithgow is uh, is kind of going through the house, and because eventually every single grief moment is turned on everyone, and John Lithgow's thing is uh, I think his wife, and so eventually gets to the point to where John Lithgow is heading down some stairs, and Ellie gruesomely like stabs him in the ankle, and he goes falling down these stairs, and basically he's left for dead at that moment. And to be showcased his most grieving moment, and for John Lithgow to at the very end to just be very defiant, and to ultimately Ellie just kills him. So yeah, that is the one thing I guess I leave off at at this weird review of this movie. But I don't know. I really overall just kind of had fun watching this movie. Like I didn't think it was too bad of a film. When going into this, I should probably have watched any number of the other Pet Cemetery movies. But I don't know. I just liked this approach of this movie. I didn't find anything bad of it. So I don't know what everybody else said of how it was a bad movie. Like when looking at it, I've probably seen some worse off films in my day. So there's some probably random things about this that probably a lot of people didn't like because they didn't really quite understand what was going on. But like I don't know, for me, I just kind of just watched it and just enjoyed it because my expectations were severely low because I thought this was going to be a really awful movie. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I was kind of very intrigued by it and kind of just interested. So let's move on. So the movie The Prodigy. Ultimately, this is just, I think, in a bat crap way of just kind of mushing a bunch of stuff that ultimately always ties into a kid's story where you have to have a horror kid story. So normally, like you gotta have the kitchen sink of horror kid kind like I don't want to say kid because it'll be like, hey, this video is made for. No, it's not. It's very rated R, definitely for sure. It's really dark. Everything is made for it's adult stuff, adult content. Yeah. So we ultimately have a kid uh, that is ultimately very much like this. This kind of comes down as a lot of very much these kinds of movies all mixed together when it comes down to a kid, and like it kind of comes down to this ending up being like The Exorcist, or in quasi some small ways being like uh, a quasi lighter variation of Brightburn a little bit, to where ultimately this kid has absolutely no superpowers, but there's some interesting things that this kid does at one point and another to kind of give you. I think this movie very much gives people an uneasy feeling, but there's like some points where you're just like, oh my god, this kid, like what a great performance with this kid. And when going into this movie, I found it intriguing, but then again, like I really didn't overall like care for this movie because I was just like, you know what, this is just like any other any other kind of approaches to this when you would just have a kid that turns evil. Like I've seen so many of these movies now that there isn't like I'm kind of tired of it. Like when I kind of hear yet another approach to this kind of movie, I was immediately just like, okay, this movie really has to give me something really unique to wet my whistle and fiddle. You know what I mean? Kind of like it really has to give me something different, and I don't think it ever really quite got there. But I think a lot of people might just like this movie just because this kid gets very vicious, and I really enjoyed some of the moments of this kid just all of a sudden just like ultimately telling, like this kid basically telling the adults like what for, like basically like this kid has the adults like in his hands kind of thing. Like he's pulling all their strings. He's the puppeteer, and he's telling them, "Walk, Johnny, walk," kind of thing. It's kind of interesting like that. And so yeah, I found this movie to be intriguing, but I felt that the overall approach is nothing that's recreating any wheels or ultimately uh, really doing anything different. Honestly, to me, in the overall approach of things. So yeah, when going into this, uh, we have we have a kid who I believe his name is Miles, and ultimately we have. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember most of the cast names. So yeah, we have a son that's named Miles, and ultimately we have a mother that I think her name is Sarah. Sarah, and I think that is like the main focal point of characters. I think everything after that is usually like a kind of doctor that goes in, or it's reasonably very much just like it's really kind of very small casted. It has like a father and stuff like that, of course, because mother, father, and like it's a very small cast, but it's mostly of people that eventually um, go in. Yeah, so this movie has an interesting hook at some point. It's interestingly waiting for when this kid starts to go on a rampage and eventually seems to get away with everything, almost getting to the point of getting away with murder. So yeah, a interesting story, but it's really just a pretty like lame duck like hook, or just kind of at some point just a rough point of story to go about doing, because it doesn't feel like we're like it feels like we've kind of scraped the bottom of the barrel of all these kinds of stories when we get to like bright burns and exorcisms and like very much stories that are like this. Basically, it's one of those where if you like these kinds of films, then ultimately like this one is probably very intriguing to you. But you kind of have to like these kinds of films where it's like The Orphan or the Omen or something like that, where the main focus is the kid getting to where they need to get to at some point in juncture. So yeah, that's I think all that I can really say in a very cryptic like sense, because reasonably it's overall just kind of a really just it's not maybe a paint by numbers movie, but I've kind of seen so many of these things before, and yeah, it's just not really like I loved some of the vicious moments, but there was a lot of stuff where it's just like it's going through the same motions. But again, some very vicious and intriguing moments. So let's go into double five time territory to talk about the spoilers of this film. I really was just kind of like, at some points, I felt like this movie was stretching things, because I'm like, why did they have to go and basically show this baby, or this new baby, just they had to show like the baby like being born and the processes of that, and the baby being cleaned and everything. Like, why did we have to show all that? Why did we have to show every single portion of this kid's life? Why? I didn't understand that. Like, why do we have to like basically? Yeah, this is kid day one, or this is the Prodigy day one. I'm like, Why do we have to go through all that? It seemed like this movie is really trying to like sift to just come up with any kind of footage that they could use to just kind of like we don't have a lot of stuff going on in this movie, so we might as well just really stretch this all out. But anyways, so in the very beginning of this movie, we basically let's go into like spoiler time now. I think it's about like there's not much to talk about this movie cryptically because again, like I think I've ran through some of these movies that it's just, like it gets there, it gets intriguing, it gets to where you're kind of excited at some portions of this. But I just saw Brightburn, and after seeing Brightburn, I'm like, eh, anything after Brightburn, it's just anything like this is just not going to be good enough because evil Superman. And so watching this one, like, mm, just didn't quite like after watching Brightburn, I'm like, I loved Brightburn, and so when going to this movie, I was just like, story's not that good, not that good as Brightburn to me. So, so let's go into the double five time territory at the end of the day. I think probably some people that probably did like the movie Brightburn will probably like this movie as well. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, The Prodigy. So, we have Sarah, and I think husband, super generic name, John. Yeah, John, I guess. Oh, God. So many freaking names of this movie. So, we have a severely generic name. Yeah, John. Um, ultimately, noticing that his like, hey, how's it going, honey? And she's basically saying like, yeah, I think it's about time. I think it's about time to have this baby come out. So they have to go through the entire seemingly process of giving birth, and then they have to clean baby, and then eventually rush us to years later of when this baby or when this kid is starting to be different. So we have in this movie the mom goes to the son and watches over him sleeping, and bizarrely he is saying some bizarre like words when he's sleeping. So at some point the mother records at some point this what this kid is saying while he's sleeping. So we have it to where it seems like Sarah and Miles do these staring contests, and so while uh, at some point um, the mother usually lets Miles wins these staring contests, and so eventually Miles asks his mother to do a staring contest again, but Miles eventually goes to like kind of touch um, his mother's hand, and eventually like starts to like kind of like mess with her hands and mess with her fingers, and to where ultimately uh, Miles's mother is just like, you know what? I don't really like how you like touch me, like it feels very uncomfortable. It feels like it feels like you're doing something inappropriate. So like the kid doesn't think anything of it. So eventually it gets down to one point to where he is like it seems like he's doing really well in school to the point to where it seems like a lot of times he is just doodling and sketching because everything to him is coming too easy to where he's just drawing up sketches of hands and stuff like that instead of actually doing his work because everything to him is so boring. So we get it to where eventually we have it to where uh, there is some counselor talking to this boy, and recently it seems that while she's talking to this boy, it seems like this kid is just like, you know what, there must be something wrong with this boy. So eventually she gets the mother and starts talking to the mother and is like, you know what, like, I don't mean to pry, but is there any like abuse going on within the home? Because ultimately when talking to this kid, it feels like there might be something there. And so immediately when Sarah comes home, she immediately talks to John, the father, and is mentioning like, well, hey, did you ever strike him or whatever? And the father's like, no, like, I would never do that to him, like, no. And so Sarah's like, well, I didn't. So like, for any bizarre reason, like, this counselor was mentioning that like our son like at some point might have like been like seemingly abused somehow. So eventually it gets to the point where this girl sends off this recording of her son sleep talking, and this eventually goes to some doctor, and this doctor says, you know what, has anyone in your family ever like picked up any like language of any kind? Has like has anyone in your family ever like learned a language or two or this and that? And Sarah's like, no. Why are you saying this? Well, ultimately the doctor breaks down and is like, well, hey, just letting you know that your son, while he's sleeping, is speaking Romanian, and this dialect is in a very rare part of the country, and like only a very small amount of people could actually speak this dialect. And immediately the mom is just like, oh, okay, are you sure that he's speaking Romanian? Like, are you sure? And the doctor's like, believe me, yes. Like, this is like, he's saying all these words. And so the doctor is even telling her what these words all are, that basically he's mentioning about killing or hurting people and this and that. And the mother is just so skeptic about all of this. She's like, I can't believe that my son is speaking not only a different language, but like he's saying all this. And so the doctor's like, well, there had there have been times where all of a sudden, like, people have known about another person's life, so much so that they know about uh, where a home is that they've never been to before, and that they've known certain family members that they've never met in their life, and like they have been very familiar with another person's life that had at some point passed on. And ultimately Sarah is just like, well, is this some kind of form of possession? And the doctor's like, you know what, I don't really want to say that is really quite what that is, because again, they don't want to say that because ultimately they don't want this movie to just be typecasted as, oh, this is just an exorcist kind of movie. But anyways, so it gets to the point to where the son is playing around with some Rubik's cube. And so the mother is kind of telling him to come down and eat or something like that. And bizarrely, when she looks at her son, his face is completely different. And then she runs in there and she's like, Miles? And he's like, what? Like what? I didn't hear what you said. So she repeats to him what she said, and ultimately she's just thinking that um, she just like must have just she's tired, and that she just is thinking of something that isn't quite correct. And at some point when she goes to dream, eventually she is in a hallway and she yells for Miles, and Miles comes running to her, and the Miles changes into this adult man that goes to hug her, and eventually she just wakes up and she's like, "Oh my god, like what is going on?" So immediately we have it to where this boy is going to go to this doctor. Here's where it really gets good. And so this doctor hypnotizes this boy. And he hypnotizes the boy and tells him, okay, to go to sleep, but eventually he wants to talk to the other presence in this boy. And so immediately we find out that the two presences within this uh within this boy, like I think at some point like you have um the normal boy with with two of the same eyes, but I think when he switches to the other personality, there's two different eyes. There's a blue eye, and then there's a hazel eye. So, and eventually before this uh we have the father that is away, and the boy ends up sleeping with his mother in the same bed, and ultimately putting his arm on her shoulder and telling her, like, "Mommy, uh will you love me no matter what?" Because eventually uh we're gonna get back to that therapy session, but right before this. So eventually our mother get the Sarah ends up getting up, uh ends up going down to the part where there's these flies, and eventually Miles gives her this hammer, and so Sarah starts to unnotch all these screws and open this part up to eventually find a dog that is not so quite alive and's been there for a while. Yeah, so that's what turns her into eventually going, I need to figure out what's going on with my son, because there's evidently really something wrong with my son. So cueing us going into this therapy session where again it really gets good. So therapy session. So we have it to where the therapist is going and talking to this boy, and he's asking for the other presence. So the other presence comes out and they start having a chat. He the doctor starts talking to him in Romanian, and so the other presence in this boy is saying, "Oh my God, hey, you know Romanian?" And he's like, "But I'd much rather like speak in English." And the doctor says it's like, "Oh well, that's good because I only knew like uh, this phrase and that phrase, and that's about all I knew." Like, because just kind of really just BS and to really figure out if this is the real deal that I'm talking to here. So we ultimately find out that this presence within this boy is very smart. And so immediately he tells this doctor, you know what, okay, you know what, I have found out while I've been here that ultimately you have uh, some medications that are stored away in in a uh, in a portion of this uh, place. And the doctor goes, well, that's like prescripted things. It's like, yeah, that's perfectly fine. What of it? And it's like, well, yeah, like that's prescription for you, but what if that's going to uh, like fall into my mouth, the thing of a little boy? And so what if I also tell them that that you did something to me, which I won't actually say what it is because I don't want any kind of issues with YouTube. And because immediately, probably once I say this, I'm going to have an issue with YouTube. So, and ultimately, he had mentioned that he had some evidence in his mouth, let's just say, of this occurrence, uh, this thing. And then and so the guy says, okay, I'm going to tell him that you did something with me, and unless you go and you tell my mom that nothing happened here, that you saw nothing, that nothing happened, that you couldn't get me to come out and talk to you. So immediately, with how smart and intelligent this other presence is, the doctor goes to the mother and just says exactly what the kid says. Says, yeah, there was nothing I could find. I couldn't find anything. There's nothing I could do. So ultimately, the mother and the kid go home for the doctor to eventually call her later on and tell her the truth. That it's like, well, hey, like, uh, hopefully your kid isn't by when you're hearing me call you. I'm going to tell you the truth. If anything, this is all what happened, and so I'm telling you this all now. And so this mother feels so just feels so unsafe with her son. And so we get to the point to where at this juncture the like there's some kind of issues happening with the husband and the wife, to where ultimately uh, John is starting to figure like some things out, because ultimately and this is the part that I kind of skipped around about. So we ultimately find out John uh, leaves the house at some point, and here is why. So John and Sarah are talking about the boy at one point, and so uh, John is bringing up about his own father, and so eventually it gets to the point to where via some car ride somewhere, the other presence is bringing up about John's father, and immediately John is like, oh my god, how did he know about this? Like, and ultimately he asks Sarah about, did you ever talk to Miles about my father or anything? And she's like, no. Well, it's like, well, then how does he know? And eventually John finds out, looking through the room, that Miles, supposedly Miles or the other presents, had been uh, baby monitoring or like keeping tabs by putting together some makeshift like recorder thing to record all their conversations via some device on one of their picture frames. And then John confronts Miles about this, and of course he doesn't know anything about it. So eventually Miles or John just leaves and disappears for a while, and then eventually comes back to pick up Miles while he's in school, and tells the teacher like, "Hey, I gotta pick up my kid. It's a family emergency. We have to go." Ultimately, Miles is not really responding, and so like John is more and more trying to get his son to get out of this class. So John is talking to Miles and telling him, "Hey, I'm going to get you some help. I'm going to send you some doctors that are going to help you, and like this is what we're going to do." And so Miles evidently has just had a let's just say uh, a of a scissor of sorts for a rainy day. And so we have to where Miles cuts his father's seatbelt. He's like, okay, what's going on? And so eventually Miles stabs his father, and then John is trying to swerve and trying to whatever because they're going full speed, and so he swerves and smacks right into a tree, and so his father is in the hospital, I think, in a coma. So Sarah takes Miles to, I think, her sister or one of her friends or something like that, to like look over Miles while this is all going on. So eventually, like, Sarah is trying to confirm all this stuff with this woman, and so because I don't know who this other woman was, but I guess it's kind of moot point within this movie. So we have it to where Sarah is telling this girl about everything, and so we have it to where eventually they are at some point playing hide and seek, and so the girl is seemingly consistently counting to five, and eventually at first this boy doesn't really go anywhere, and so she's like, well, I guess I'll count longer, and so eventually the boy eventually does hide. So she starts to look all over the place and can't find the boy, and so eventually she goes down to the basement, and of course the basement has a staircase. And so this girl starts heading down this staircase, and wouldn't you know it, the boy had left some broken bottles and glass on one of the steps. And the girl steps right on it and then falls down the stairs for him to eventually stab her and kill her. So, leading us now to where the boy only it's basically just the 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 mother and the son left. And when the mother was going to this friend's home, she basically had to give her son sleeping pills so that way, because she didn't trust him. She didn't trust him. She had to make him give him, she had to forcibly give him sleeping pills so that way she could be safe around him, which is freaking weird. So we eventually get Sarah having to get a gun to be around her kid, to feel safe around her kid, which is crazy. So Sarah comes home to ultimately try to find her friend, and instead uh, ends up finding her son, and so eventually gets to the point to where we we get it to where now we basically just like the mother is just like, I have to get rid of my son because reasonably I can't trust him. I think it's this is it. So eventually she takes her son all the way out to this area out to seemingly anywhere, and she is going to just have to take her son out because he's just going to keep on killing. So we get to the point where she is going to put a gun to her son, and there is some forest forest hunter from out of middle of nowhere that ends up shooting her and taking her down because he's like, oh my god, you were going to do that to him. And she's like, no, you don't understand. Because ultimately we find out that this boy had never really truly been her son for a very long time. That ultimately the 100% point time uh, where this possessed thing took over was right around the time where the kid put the shoulder, put the hand on this girl, on the Sarah's shoulder, and told her like that, would you still love me if, like, would you still love me no matter what? And right after that, that was the point where the possessed thing took over. And so yeah, this this thing could not just stop killing. Um, Crazy enough. So the mother tried to take this thing out, and it didn't work. Didn't take. And so yeah, at some point, like this thing just kept on like killing. So it gets to the point to where the hunter is just not doing any better, and so reasonably the mom is like, you don't understand, and so eventually the boy ends up taking out his own mother, to where eventually he is left to some foster family until his supposedly dad gets out of the hospital. And that's really just how the movie just kind of just ends at it all. So yeah, hopefully I remembered all that perfectly and all well and good and everything like that. So um, because yeah, I think there was at some point where eventually the boy like attacked one of the women and kind of mentioned how his blue eyes, hazel eyes, eventually just attacked this girl and this and that. So I hope there was at some point where I didn't get something way too off or way too confused or this and that. But Because I know there were probably maybe an early portion of this movie that I probably mixed up or something like that. But yeah, other than that, pretty interesting movie. But yeah, it kind of just like you got to get to those points where it gets really actually intriguing and where uh, eventually you get very just like, oh my god, wow, okay. Um, yeah, for the girl that plays Sarah, I remember her from Orange Is the New Black, and so ultimately to see her playing this, I'm like, okay, really not much bringing anything new to the table, but if anything, overall, like I liked some of the ways of which uh, this story went and how it got to the point where the parents were feeling so desperate to eventually try to get rid of this kid somehow. And yeah, it just came for a very quasi interesting story, if not a story that we haven't probably heard quasi through some kind of ways in which. So, if there probably is another movie like this besides Brightburn or probably some other movie that I've probably either heard or seen. I never saw the movie The Orphan, but I don't know. I was just kind of throwing that as an example of like it feels like The Orphan or The Boy or any number of movies that I probably haven't probably seen at some point because I just like I kind of tend to avoid these kinds of movies because I'm like they're all the same. They're all just another. It's either a ghost inside of a person or a possession or a demon or a whatever. It's all the same. There's nothing cool or interesting going on. So that's why I tend to next a lot of these movies because I'm like, if anything, I want to see like adults doing things. I don't really care that much for like a kid that's just like I don't really care for those kinds of movies. But at the end of the day, this one was just intriguing enough to get me interested in this movie. So I'm going to interestingly enough get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.